Okie doke. So we made it through carbohydrates. Remember, carbs, their primary function is to provide fast energy. So it can be burnt by your cells and give you a whole bunch of energy. Okay, now we're going on to our next category of biomolecules, which are the lipids. And so an example of a lipid is shown here. So yeah, they're really big, they're really complex, very necessary, especially to our cell structure. But if any of you have ever tried to lose weight, you also realize that lipids are really stubborn and tough to get rid of too. Okay, so lipids are essentially fats. Just like carbohydrates, they're pretty simple in terms of their atomic structure. They're made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Maybe we stick in an additional nitrogen or a phosphorus once in a while. But yeah, actually, in terms of how many atoms they're made up of, yeah, pretty simple. So here are some examples of lipids, what we call neutral fats or triglycerides. So a lot of you guys are really young, but when you get to be my age, one of the things that your doctor likes to test for about once a year is free triglycerides in your blood, because if those tend to be high, it can lead to building up plaques and it can lead to heart disease. Okay, so yeah, when you get to be my age, you kind of have to worry about that. Also, we're going to talk about phospholipids, which make up your cell membranes. So they are really important. And then I also want to mention that lipids fit into a class of compounds that we call steroids. Now, steroids, when most people hear that word, they automatically go to thinking about anabolic steroids, which are illegal, that are bad for you. They cause roid rage, when people take them to try to build muscle. So one thing I want you to understand is that the word steroid itself is not a dirty word. Steroid actually refers to just compounds that have a particular 4-carbon ring structure. And steroids are found naturally in our body. So, let's see, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, cholesterol. Those are all examples of steroids that are found naturally in our body. Anabolic steroids are actually completely manufactured in a lab and are a lot different. Okay, so I want you to know that the word steroid is not a naughty word, and lipids fit into the class of compounds that we call steroids. Okay, so let me talk about phospholipids. And phospholipids are lipids that help make up your cell membrane. Okay, so one thing I want you guys to promise me is that you will never go on a fat-free diet. Certainly there are healthier lipids that you can consume, like those found in nuts and avocados and fish and nutritional items like that. But you never want to go on a completely fat-free diet. And that is because every single membrane in every cell of your body is made up of lipids. And so you need to have lipids in your system to keep your cells functioning properly. Now, you'll notice in textbooks, and I don't know why this is, but cells are always drawn like a perfectly round circle or ball. So a typical cell doesn't look like that. If it did, we would all look like perfectly round circles or balls. And obviously we don't. So cells can really be fluid in terms of their structure. In fact, one of your cell membranes has the consistency of olive oil. So if you've ever put olive oil into a pan and seen how it moves, that's actually the consistency of the phospholipids that make up your cell membranes. Okay, so your cells can, change shape and be able to move a little bit. So one of the things I wanted to show you though, so if we kind of zoom in on the cell structure, this is what a lipid looks like. Okay, so it has this, what is shown as a yellow ball, and that corresponds to the phospholipid head. And then lipids kind of look like teeth or molars. I mean, that's what I think they kind of look like. They have this, double branched structure that kind of looks like that. And you actually, all of your cells are made up of a lipid bilayer. So you have lipids that face each other, and then in the center of the membrane, it's where the lipid tails interact. Okay, so let me zoom out on this. Okay, so up here, this represents the yellow ball. That's where the phosphorus is. So that's the phospholipid head. And then lipids have these long tails. Okay, so when you look at the tails, this is something I want you to understand, and we actually talk about it in the next slide. But if you look at this lipid tail, it's nice and consistent. It's actually made up of a carbon and then 3 hydrogens. So what that means is, first of all, the carbons that are in lipids are super happy and stable because they're forming 4 different bonds with other atoms and covalent bonds. And what that means is that their electron shells are full. So carbon molecules in lipid molecules are really happy and saturated. And that's why it's so hard to get rid of lipids. Hence, losing weight is really hard and requires a lot of energy. Okay, but I want you to note the difference between this lipid tail and this lipid tail. So notice this one has a little bit of a kink to it. And if I zoom in on it, you'll notice that instead of having a single bond, which is a one little line, it has what looks like an equal sign. And that means that those 2 carbons have a double bond. And you might think that a double bond would make things twice as strong. But in terms of lipid, it actually makes this lipid tail a little weaker, and it's able to be broken apart. Okay, so let me go to the next slide. And here we're looking a little closer at that, and it actually shows the difference between what we call a saturated fat and an unsaturated fat. Okay, so a saturated fat has no double bonds, and so it creates this really long uniform tail. And if we zoom in on this, you'll see that the carbons, each one of them has 1 bond here to 2 different hydrogens, and then is also bonding to 2 different carbons for a total of 4 single bonds. And so these are carbons, they are really saturated and fat and happy and stable, and they don't want to go anywhere. So it takes a lot of energy to break apart saturated fats. But if we look at what we call an unsaturated fat, these are the ones that have a double bond, and it produces this little kink in the chain, and that actually makes it easier to break down. Okay, so saturated fats are things that are solid at room temperature. So think of your typical stick of butter, just, that is a solid at room temperature. That is all saturated fat. If we think of compounds that are unsaturated fats, these are liquid at room temperature. So any, like vegetable oil, olive oil, canola oil, all of those are unsaturated fats. So when we think of in terms of our diet, it's always better to eat unsaturated fats. And really, if you've heard the term polyunsaturated, what that means is it has more than one of these double bonds. And so you have a bunch of kinks in the chain, and that actually makes it much easier to break down the lipids. Unfortunately, saturated fats are super delicious. I don't know if you guys have ever had like fried chicken that's cooked with Crisco or what is basically lard. Ooh, it's so delicious. But it's made up of saturated fat, and so when we eat it, it causes our lipids to look like this and makes them really hard to break down. And if you consume way too much saturated fat, that can be bad for you, especially when you get to my age, because that's when you see, plaques in your arteries start to develop. It can lead to heart disease. So yeah, it's much better for you to eat a diet that is high in unsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. We can still take in saturated fats. I mean, you find that in a lot of nuts and things like avocados, but you want to limit your intake of those. You want to eat more unsaturated fats. Okay, so those are the two types of fats, and then there's a third category, which is called trans fats. And you guys may have heard about these because they're basically considered kind of the pornography of fats. Like, they're so delicious that you don't want to eat them. In fact, trans fats are illegal in New York City. They've banned them, so any restaurant found using trans fats can be shut down. Trans fats, it's kind of interesting. It started out as a really good intentioned project. What happened was at the Food and Drug Administration, okay, they knew the difference between unsaturated and saturated fats. And so some scientist at the FDA said, you know what, we know that polyunsaturated fats are really healthier, so let's create a super unsaturated fat and it'll be really healthy, right? Okay, good intentions, but wrong. But because what they created was a fat that was so unsaturated that it basically had this zigzag structure. And what they didn't see happening is that all of these zigzags could fit right on top of each other and form a really thick fat that is literally impossible to break down and to get out of your arteries. That was the trans fat. Okay, so most fast food chains, for example, have gotten rid of trans fats. One of the things I want you to be aware of, though, as a consumer, when you go to the grocery store, a lot of products use, it'll say on them, 0 trans fats. And that's supposed to be a big marketing ploy to have you think that the product is really healthy. But if you look closer on the label, they might have 0 trans fats, but still be really high in saturated fats. Okay, so it may still not be the healthiest for you. So ideally, you want to look to buy products that are high in unsaturated or polyunsaturated fat. Okay, but the way I think of it is a saturated fat would be like a really comfy blanket that you might cover up in, like it when you're snuggling on the couch watching Netflix. An unsaturated fat would be like a sheet, okay, so not as warm. A trans fat would be like the goose down comforter that you buy from Crate and Barrel that costs $300 that is so hot that you end up throwing it off you in the middle of the night because it's so thick. That's what the trans fat is. Okay, so that's the difference between the three of them. Okay, so that takes us to fats. I'm going to go ahead and upload this video, and then we're going to hit amino acids and proteins in our last chapter 2 lecture video. Okay, thank you.